By now, most Marvel fans are aware that Loki comes in many shapes and sizes. With a half dozen Lokis running around the Disney Plus series, not every variant got quite the attention they deserved, but Kid Loki stuck out as quite different from his comic book counterpart. Today, we're going to look at 10 big differences between Kid Loki in the comics and Kid Loki in the MCU. 10. The first big difference to note between the MCU's Kid Loki and that of the comics is that the Loki of the Marvel 616 really did take the form of a kid after being reincarnated. This just wasn't an alternate version of Loki whose life went differently, it was actually the real Loki who came back as a kid. 9. Little is known about the MCU's Kid Loki, but what we do know stands out. One of the biggest facts about him is that he killed his world's Thor, which was an achievement the comic Kid Loki never even came close to. 8. Part of the reason the comics Loki never came close to killing his Thor is that he was actually a good guy. Loki is quite often bad, and even the MCU's Loki had a sinister streak when they hinted at his Thor-slaying past, but in the comic books, Kid Loki actually worshipped his big brother. 7. Kid Loki's sword stood out in the Disney Plus series, offered to his counterpart as a parting gift. The flaming blade is known as the Lave 18 in Norse legend, and it's spotted a few times in the comics. But in the comics, it appears quite different and never catches fire like in the MCU. 6. In keeping with the comics version do-gooder nature, he actually became a member of the Young Avengers. In the show, the young miscreant had only himself for company, even if it was a bunch of different versions of himself from alternate realities. Still, it's not quite the same thing as joining a version of the Young Avengers. 5. In terms of sheer power, there's little question that the Kid Loki of the comics wins with the comparisons. In the MCU, he never really shows off any magic, but in the comics, he can do things like summoning demons and crossing through to other dimensions. 4. Though the MCU draws inspiration from the comics, it's clear the two versions have a different look. The 616 version notably had his hair tucked into his costume, while the one on the TV show, or the Disney Plus series as I should say, had really long flowing locks. Other than that, it's obvious that these guys both are supposed to be versions of Loki. 3. The memories of the Lokis clearly diverge as well. Whereas in the 616 comic books, Kid Loki cannot quite remember much from his past life, the MCU's version seems perfectly on the same page with his older counterparts. Maybe they filled him in during their downtime in the lair, or perhaps he just didn't lose his memory like the Kid Loki from the comics did. 2. Crocodile Loki, or Crocky, sadly did not appear alongside Kid Loki in the comics. The partnership between the two already demands its own 8-episode spin-off in my honest opinion, and fans hoping to find more of that story in the comics will just have to wait to see if the inspiration cuts both ways, because as of yet, the Crocodile Loki is not anywhere to be found. 1. The biggest difference between the Kid Lokis from the MCU and the comics is where the MCU's Kid Loki happens to live, in that imprisonment at the edge of time. Constantly running from Aliath, the MCU version lived out the rest of his doomed days against an apocalyptic wasteland. And in the comics, Kid Loki runs amok on Earth alongside all the other Marvel superheroes and villains. There's definitely more to explore with the possibility in the future, and given Kang's contrivances, with time, it could well possibly happen in the MCU, but that's a pretty big difference. The comic book Loki, or at least the comic book Kid Loki, spent a lot of time hopping around from planet to planet, and especially on Earth, he spent a lot of time roaming around with Young Avengers.